Approaching this process has been rather unique because nobody so far has actually looked at the laundering of cryptocurrencies from a systems perspective. And cryptocurrencies have gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of years, not the least of which is because they've achieved $20,000 in value per Bitcoin last year, and as of today, it's dropped below 8,000, so there's a lot of volatility. But also, it's a primary mechanism that bad guys use to buy and sell illicit products on the darknet, but also for ransomware. Typically, victims are paying via Bitcoin, Monero, or Ethereum. But the other problem is there's a lack of comprehensive and consistent regulatory framework globally, which allows enforcers to actually investigate and arrest money launderers using cryptocurrency. Almost consistently, they're relying on what's called a predicate offense, that is the crime, for their detection and intervention. So I thought by looking at crypto laundering from the perspective of a systems approach and classifying it as a complex socio-technical system, that I might be able to identify what's called attack surfaces or vulnerable nodes that might allow them to disrupt the crypto laundering process from a larger perspective. Two of my favorite phraseologies now in systems thinking are unruly technologies and oppositional human factors. So what I want to actually do is enhance the unruly technology activities, and then also look at potential oppositional human factors for targeting these vulnerable nodes if, in fact, I can actually find them through the systems analysis. Dun, dun, dun. Technology. Yay, okay. Blank slide, isn't that great? This is gonna be the least complex slide you're gonna see today. So the way I did this is, first I had to actually figure out the data sources. Now, typically within systems, you want to interview people or you want to observe money laundering. So of the criminals that I asked to allow me to sit next to them at the computer while they allow themselves to launder money, nobody said yes. Imagine that. Probably because I'm a former FBI agent, and so that probably didn't help. So I actually had to do an observational approach from the perspective of I'm going to sit and I'm going to watch what's called open source intelligence, and I'm going to collect all this data from all the forums where these guys are posting information about their activities. Now, they feel pretty comfortable that they're posting anonymously because they're using virtual private networks, they're masking their IP address, they're using Tor, they're creating fake identities and personas online. So they felt pretty comfortable talking about what they're doing. That was really helpful from the data collection perspective because they felt free to talk about how they did what they did. And then, of course, I also looked at some of the official judicial documentation from Department of Justice, my old boss, as well as some of the Australian law enforcement documentation on indictments and prosecutions. So next, I went ahead and harvested everything. Literally just downloaded thousands and thousands of conversations and documents. From there, I converted those into a portable document format, and then which allowed me to ingest them through Leximancer and do keyword and phraseology analysis. I also wanted to look a little bit about the language that they were using, how they were talking about the process, and looking for comparisons and contrasts between the law enforcement side and the actual launderer side. And that gave me some really interesting thoughts and ideas. So then, from all these conversations, I had to start building models. Last count, I was over 35 different money laundering models. Fortunately, I'm only going to show you guys 3 of them, so you can thank me for that. And then, of course, I decided to go ahead and develop a work domain analysis, which is the first step in the cognitive work analysis process, to actually map out the system to see what it looked like. And then lastly, on the analytical side, I looked at expertise. I looked at what's called tradecraft. How did they mask their identities? How did they mask their source IP address? Were they teaching each other, mentoring each other about these processes and what was best to do and what not to do? And then there was a little bit of ESL learning, English as a second language, which apparently I am learning. And then looking at specifically maybe country of origin, because a lot of the launderers were actually coming out of Eastern Europe. I also looked at, anybody know what confabulation is? Anybody watch X-Files? X-Files fans, there we go. So confabulation is misunderstanding what you see on TV or in the movies and then putting it into a real-world context. A lot of these guys were big fans of Breaking Bad, Ozark, and other movies that incorporated money laundering, and they would spit these models back out as though that this was their idea on how to launder cryptocurrencies. So my data sources. On the left there, that's the surface net or ClearNet. That's the stuff I could go out to Reddit, 4chan, 8chan, and actually harvest the data, looking for specifically laundering techniques. Of course, thank you, law enforcement, for taking down a lot of my data sources. Fortunately, I was able to harvest a lot of the stuff before they did that. The center is darknet. Darknet markets, about which Dr. Lane is going to talk about in a little while, pretty much onion networks where the ability to post anonymously and where a lot of illegal activities occur is also where I pulled a lot of the data. And then lastly, the very boring Department of Justice and law enforcement stuff, which is written in a very specific way, very specific language, and presented in a very specific format structure. So this is an example of a lexomancer analysis, giving me keywords, terminologies, phrases, basically telling me what was important to the launderers, to the posters. Anybody see the word pizza up there? Why do you think pizza's up there? Anybody from New Jersey? So in the United States, pizza parlors are like the #1 mafia front organization for cash-based businesses laundering money. And so the posters basically would say, hey, this is a great idea. Everybody open up an LLC, call it a pizza parlor, and you can move Bitcoin through it. So I had to take key terms like that and lump them all into something like a front company or an LLC that could be used for laundering processes. So there was a little bit of play at work. Instead of saying Monero, Ethereum, Bitcoin, it's cryptocurrency. So there was a little bit of consolidation of keyword terminology and phraseology. I also tried another way too. I wanted to look at the emphasis that they were placing within a conversation of a specific word as well. So I went ahead and did some word cloud analysis. And part of this was to be able to absorb some of the terms that were being used within a thread, it's called, and kind of look at how they were presenting themselves and what keywords were important to the individual launderer as well. So in looking at these different models, this is probably the simplest model that you can have for laundering cryptocurrencies. Some guy goes out on Payspin and basically says, hey, I need to launder a lot of money. Anybody who invests clean Bitcoin with me will get a return on investment of 0.1% or 1%. They've got so much money to move that their return on investment is actually spending an extra 1,000 here, 2,000 there. So in this case, they completely bypass the financial system. So this is a simple model that I would have to develop based on the terminology that I was seeing. A little more complex is this, where you have the traditional approach for money laundering. In this case, this is how you would actually move a lot of money through the system. This is the most complex one. The problem is crypto laundering doesn't really fit nicely into conventional money laundering, placement layer integration, because you literally can put Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies anywhere in the system. And you don't have to actually participate in a traditional financial system, such as a bank or a credit bureau. And that was one of the complexities, is figuring out all these different models and how to integrate them into one gigantic model for money laundering. And then here's the generic version that I came up with. Pretty straightforward. A pseudonymous wallet. Not anonymous, pseudonymous, because there are some attributes of identity that can be attached to it that help law enforcement identify the wallet location, where it was created, what company it was created with, and certain other attributes. I had to show you a complex work domain analysis slide. It's like a requirement for us to stand up here and be able to talk about systems. I still have a PhD, right? To go work, so, okay. So in this case, it's an unregulated exchange. And all the red marks, that's where that node, that unregulated exchange specifically, was showing the connections above and below. Now I came out with 8 functional purposes, 25 value and priority measures, which are the metrics, the measure of the functional purposes and whether or not they're successful. 36 purpose-related functions, 140 object-related processes, and literally 132 separate digital and physical objects that contribute to the laundering of cryptocurrencies. That is a complex system. The takeaways, what I got out of that was specifically the use of unregulated exchanges is a critical node, which means basically 24 out of 25 of the VPMs were connected to that specific node. Moreover, if you look, 59 separate processes contribute to using that unregulated or uncontrolled exchange. Now, literally, any one of you in this room can set up your own unregulated exchange if you've got enough cash. It's easy, and therefore you can imagine that enforcement and interdiction is really, really hard. If you look at circumvent regulatory framework, yes, we've got regulations, awesome. We as systems people love regulations, right? Guess what? The circumvent regulatory framework was a significant effort on the part of the criminals. They went around the regulations. They found ways to circumvent those regulatory framework that were imposed upon them, and therefore avoid detection or avoid enforcement. Support illicit financial transactions, 99 separate object-related processes are focused on laundering money. That is a significant effort within the system. Conversely, only 4 value and priority measures were relying on detect AML triggers. What that tells me is, even though we're working really, really hard to circumvent the framework, they didn't care if they tripped a trigger. They didn't care if they were detected. They were doing enough things to circumvent the system to make their money laundering successful, or their ROI was significant enough, it was worth the risk. This process is going to lead me to be able to move on to further analysis, to continue to look at the crypto laundering process. My next step is doing an East analysis, looking at the sociometric connections, looking at the social network analysis, the task analysis, and being able to map out the system to really identify the actors, the entities, and the connections that these launderers are making within each other. And it's a little bit of a different process, as I said. Rather than relying on a predicate offense to intervene, I'm looking at causing system failure. I want to break it. I want it to fail. And it's a matter of coming up with methods that will focus specifically on targeting what we call attack surfaces, or those nodes, that will allow us to influence not only the behavior of the actors, but also to take down the system itself. Subject to your questions, that concludes my briefing.
Questions over here? Wait for the microphone, please.
Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to ask about was, you're looking at these different forums and you're looking at people basically going to learn, a lot of people passing their tradecraft back and forth. So as a question on scale, how does this work for larger players? Are you possibly catching minnow, or mainly sifting through minnows and possibly missing whales?
Great question. So what you see if you compare the legal documentation from the postings, the threshold for the legal prosecutions typically are much, much higher, because they have a legal threshold for actually going after somebody. We're talking hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars. On the side that you typically see, from what I've seen looking at the postings, they're talking maybe 5,000, 10,000, less than 100,000 typically. But I think the models are valuable because what they allow you to do is actually look specifically at the process for laundering of the funds. So yes, that is definitely a potential, but I think if you can overlay the templates of the different models and you start getting indicators of people circumventing, like blockchain analysis as an example, you see a lot of cryptocurrency moving through the blockchain, that at least gives you an indicator that you need to look for some sort of model that's related to the expenditure of those funds. But yes, that is certainly a concern.
Right in front here.
Given the amount of money that is being laundered and the high stakes for these people who are actually going through it, is there the risk that once you've identified anything, it's changed and it's going to be a constantly changing game so that you never actually get on top of it?
I count on that. It literally changes weekly. It's playing whack-a-mole in some cases, because as a model develops, they will adapt. And I tell you, this is one of the most agile systems I've ever seen. Terrorist financing is a good example of this right now. Some of the predicate offenses aren't actually illegal activities. It's to disassociate the donor from the recipient. So there's no actual crime committed until it actually makes it into a terrorist organization. So looking at that specifically, they're very good at publishing This is how you get around it. These are the kinds of tumblers and mixers you use. These are the ways that you move your money. Anybody see the news about Westpac lately? So yeah, it's very adaptive, very agile, and very flexible. So it's a constant process, which means I'll either be employed for a really long time, or I will miss a whole bunch of stuff. So yeah, but you're right, it is very flexible and agile, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you, Dennis.